Hello, my name is James Bowden, and this is my hot take. And I'm going to do this in one take as best as I can. I'm not going to go back and re edit it or try to make it excessively smooth and enhanced. You may also hear from time to time emergency sirens in the background. It's not visible, but it is heavily raining today. And living on one of the main drags in my city, there are a lot of people who apparently are banging into one another and causing all kinds of issues, especially in regard to having traffic accidents. Now, this video is designed as a hot take on Dr. Martin Scott Catino and his video on Shining Path, and it's entitled Anthropologists and the Rise of the Shining Path. And boiling down the entire content of Dr. Catino's message is basically, if I could use an analogy, you're a frog and you need to be more like a lobster, if not aiming to be a lobster. And he continually says, well, there are different expectations for anthropologists or the social sciences, but you've got to be different. You've got to have this mindset that says, I'm not going to stay there and I'm going to have different interests and I'm going to go into security studies. And as you can see, I am pretty hot about this. This is my hot take because, again, it is an argument that really kind of reminds me of somebody that I was in a very toxic relationship with, where they constantly berated me for not being something that I am not. And I had to continually express to them that when you, especially when you get into the level of marriage, you have to understand that you are marrying the person you are marrying. Does that have bearing here? Yes, it does, because Dr. Catino's entire argument, again, as I have said, is couched in terms of failure. He begins his video by saying that it is an analysis and not a criticism, yet every word and every point is there was failure. There was failure. And one can only fail if one has a basic expectation. If I am expected to reach a certain level and I don't get there, then I have failed. But if I'm not aiming for that level, if my intent is not to get to that point, then I have not failed. If somebody comes up to me and says, James, you failed at running the 100-meter dash, then I'm going to look at them and say, I have not failed because I haven't even tried and I have no interest in trying to do the 100-meter dash. I'm not failing. I'm just simply not doing. And there is a very important difference in that. So again, I don't like the fact that his entire message is basically you're failing to meet my expectations and I want you to be different. And then number two, and we'll get to this in a few minutes, but you know, it's almost like Dr. Catino imagines that it's his expectations that everybody else should be meeting. Uh, so again, he criticizes people for being frogs and not living up to being lobsters that he wants them to be. And he constantly refers and couches things in the language of failure. Uh, so this all centers on his criticism of anthropologic research, anthropologic research and Shining Path. So Shining Path arose in a very particular part of Peru, and its rise happened while some anthropologists were in the field. And Dr. Catino and apparently other people have been highly critical of the anthropologists who were conducting research during this time, and apparently did not note the rise of Shining Path, or did not specify and were not vocal about its emergence. And I will get to some of those reasons why I think took place in a few moments. Uh, but let's understand, let's get some orientation here. Dr. Scott Catino is really great, and from what I understand, has a good reputation, a great reputation in security studies. So, international securities, military science, those areas. And he has written a large number of articles, presentations. He is a professor of this and has been at multiple universities. He has taught or is teaching at Liberty University and at Henry Putnam University. Um, so he's very well known. But the thing is that he is criticizing people from an entirely different science perspective. He criticize he criticizes anthropologists. Anthropologists study man. They study people. They study their habits, their modes of life. Economics is a very strong element in anthropological studies, how they will conduct their social life, what their social life anchors upon, what are the most important values, family values, community values, national values, those types of things. In fact, I've read some anthropological material in seeking to understand certain communities in the Middle East, both ancient Near East wise and historically, particularly the Bedouins. Now, anthropology is a very distinct branch of science. It did start underneath history, but it broke away. And for reasons which I will not go into, at least in this video. But the point is that even I, as a person whose core identity and studies focus on history, I realize that anthropologists are seeking to answer very different questions and reveal very different facts. And that came home to me in pursuit of trying to answer a question that I had. And that information kind of hinted there, but it was not fully responsive. I was not happy that it was not responsive, but I understood that this is not their cup of tea. And one of the main things that anthropologists largely eschew is violence, studies of violence. I was seeking to understand Bedouin values for violence. How do they train for violence? What is their structure for fighting? But none of these answers were provided. And it stemmed from a bit of a frustration dealing with a particular scholar named Stephen Rosen, who I'm not sure if he is still alive. He was mainly active in the 1970s and 1980s. And he had made several statements that I deeply disagreed with regarding archery and the presence and the reason for archery in Neolithic communities. And I was supporting and arguing for a position that Neolithic hunters used archery for combat as well as for game hunting, or what is called subsistence economy. So, and that just kind of illustrates that fact. And I looked at Bedouin communities in Africa, the Middle East, and defined what the Middle East is. which anthropologists have very different views of what the Middle East is and can constitute countries as far away as Afghanistan and Armenia. So, again, there's a lot of terminological flexibility, nomenclature flexibility, which does not transcend even between historians and anthropologists. Historians, we are people who are really, most people think that we just study the past, but our main area, our scientific heritage, is in text and the science of text and verifying whether the information in text are accurate or not. It started with the donation of Constantine, which was found to be a fraud, and is cited at that research into that document is cited as one of the uh, many birthing streams that flowed into the mainstream of history studies. So, and then there's archaeology, which is the science of objects and what some people have called the science of trash. It's what was left behind. Excuse me. I mean, and that's really true. It's what is found in burials, it's what is found in cities, it's what's found on the surface and below. And so archaeologists are also seeking to understand life in the past, but they're seeking to understand it through objects, while anthropologists are seeking to understand human life through living example. Now, some uh, archaeological research does not translate into historical research, and some, we do try to do interdisciplinary studies, but we're drawing ideas and we're drawing concepts from one another. However, there's something very specific about those of us involved in these social sciences, and which probably makes me one of the very few and rare examples of something that I will get to. And that is, we're all probably just a tad or very autistic. We love our studies, we love our areas, and we very much dislike going outside of our professional zone. We get a lot of depth in our profession. We learn the rules of the road. We have our guardrails. And when we cross over or we attempt to cross over into different fields and studies, we often get highly penalized, especially in peer review and by colleagues, because they will criticize us for having gone outside the guardrails, having broken the guardrails and gone careening outside of our fields. And well, your research may be valid, but we're not really sure because that's not history or that's not anthropology. And so you can't make very valid statements regarding this if you're outside of your domain. To a degree, I agree. To a degree, I do not. I enjoy having some freedom, like the tyrannosaur in Jurassic Park, to wander through inside and out of some of the different paddocks into anthropology and into archaeology, sometimes even into security studies, in order to get answers for the questions. But I am, again, very much an exception, and I will talk about that exception in a minute. Returning to my notes, uh, and as I was trying to indicate a few minutes ago, anthropologists generally have a leftist orientation. I think that pursuit of the study of man is very deeply embedded in the humanist movement, which originally had a pseudo spiritual function, but over the centuries has grown into a very anti God, anti religion type of focus. In fact, one man left being a missionary and apparently left the Christian faith to pursue anthropology studies. And so, with that leftist orientation, they do tend to eschew violence. They tend to elevate economics and different functions of human existence. And so, I think that Dr. Catino's critique of anthropologists is without an understanding of what their basic orientation is. And it is very likely that provided these anthropologists truly did not see the rise of Shining Path, it may have been because these were already very shared political and social values. And so they were not tipped off to any perception of danger. It's not like if a conservative person were to go into this area and see these ideas about communism or socialism and be all really kind of wigged out and afraid. No, these, you only will recognize that kind of thing if you are in danger. If I go into certain areas, I know that I am safe. And so my threat perception is set very low. If I go into an unknown neighborhood or an area that, I can start seeing some fairly demonstrable signs of problems, then my threat perception elevates significantly. But the point is that Dr. Catino's criticism is based on his own self-awareness and his own perspective in these matters. So it would naturally raise his threat perception a lot higher and probably a lot sooner than it would these anthropologists. Uh, so yeah, I'm just looking over my notes here. And I will say, he also criticizes narrow focus. And again, this is something that he goes over again and again, pounding the table like, why are you narrowly focused? How dare you be narrowly focused? That's terrible, being narrowly focused. But let's get real. And this is something that I think security studies could actually take from the social studies. Social scientists and historians, we are all pressured into being narrowly focused. We are all called upon to have a specialty. I feel horribly stressed sometimes when I walk into, and I largely don't go to conferences because not only are they huge social settings and situations, but also everybody's second thing out of their mouth, it's like, hi, what's your name? And what's your specialty? And I have a hard time answering that question because if I say the Middle East, that is not acceptable for them. They want something far more narrow. They want something narrower. And there is a lot of peer pressure, especially in a peer review process. And it comes through even when you're going through school. You need to tighten your focus. Your paper needs to be narrow. It needs to have, just right in that straight zone. Everything is about the narrow, the straight and narrow. And so when you are in an environment that compels you to be very narrow in your focus, you begin to acculturate yourself to believing that that's all you can do or should do. And anthropologists and historians and even archaeologists are constantly pressured to stay within their narrow specialty, but also have something unique to say. Uh, and his criticism is that, how dare these anthropologists, they studied this area, but they didn't study this other area. Why didn't they go to this other social area? Because the pressure to study a very narrow field, very narrow uh, type of people. I have picked up books on anthropology, again, going back to the Bedouins, where it's not just Bedouins in general. You can find isolated studies on the Bedouins of Egypt, Sinai, the Sinai Peninsula, and South and southern Israel. And they're all on the same rough geographic parallel lines, and yet you can find books on all three, and none of the twain shall ever meet. There's little to no bleed over, and if they mention it, it's very peripheral comments about Egypt over here and Israel over there, or vice versa. So we are put into pressures. There's a lot of pressure exerted on us to be very narrowly focused, uh, have just this very microscopic lens through which to view things. And if things escape our periphery, then what we say is, that's not in my specialty. And that actually is a help. That helps release you from a world of social and conversational uh, pressure, because you can simply say, well, that's easily not within my specialty. But for Dr. Catino, that's not good enough, because he follows that criticism up with, you know, as a security expert, you need to be uh, branching out. You need to be going beyond. And these anthropologists, they need to have more interest in military science. He literally says this. You anthropologists need to have more interest in military science. Why? I asked Dr. Catino very straightforwardly, answer the vital question: why? Because I can give you a lot of anthropologists who would gladly tell you, why not? Again, social pressure, professional pressure, academic training pressure to be narrowly focused, and to constantly have to produce something original or a very strong variation on somebody else's research. And you got to be very careful about that. In securities, you can publish about the same thing as much as you want, it seems, at least online. I'm not 100% sure about security studies in a journal, because I've not tried to publish in one of those journals. Now, I have published in a journal of international affairs. I have published in a journal of archaeology, and I have published in a handful of journals on history. Showing my interdisciplinary studies habit. But again, not yet going into the security, so I'm not quite sure. Somebody might say, well, this article is not original enough. It doesn't take as different a view of things. Uh, and I would be very surprised if that was not a need within those studies. So we need to have a very strong justification for why we should have any interest in aspiring to be something more or different. We're not Data, we're not Seven of Nine, and we're not several other characters in TV shows who are challenged to be aspirational about going beyond their programming. Again, as I say, most of us score only very high on the autism and the I don't give about anything else outside of this world I have. And that goes for everything. That might go for mathematics, that might go for securities, that might go for science, it might go for a whole realm of things. For many anthropologists, studying security studies is as enabling and helpful as studying Paris fashions. It just doesn't fit. And I'm sure that anthropologists will study it and will comment on it if it enters into their remit in some way, if it can add something about the human condition. But again, they are conditioned to likely not look in that area because of political or personal orientation. Another fundamental reason, getting back to the brass tacks of the theme here, why was there not a anthropologic investigation into uh, Shining Path? I can tell you that many security studies people understand that there are significant personal risks for getting involved in political action. And I'm going to go into a personal area or two here in a minute, but I will tell you that most anthropologists, most researchers, historians included, understand that they run risk when they go into foreign countries. They run a risk from the foreign governments believing that they are going in as secret agitators and trying to foster revolution and encourage rebellion among the people. And among the people that they are studying, they could run the risk of being accused of asking certain questions or looking into certain areas, and thus accused of engaging in espionage and spying. I I had it brought to me very close to home. Now, there was a researcher. He was Italian. He was a PhD student. I believe he was an anthropologist, PhD student, and he was talking to groups in Egypt which were considered opposition groups by the government. The government had interior ministry, i.e., interior intelligence agents attached to him like white on rice. And when he failed to give money to some of the people in the communities that he was studying, they were asking him for money because they saw him as a bank to withdraw funds from. And he refused. And so what they did was that they fed off of the Egyptian government's already heightened concerns and paranoia over what he was researching. And he ended up being a dead body along a road in Egypt rather than a PhD student. And this is the great risk that researchers face. They can end up dead by either these groups or the governments because there's a lot of misunderstanding and there is a perpetual paranoia and fear. This has hit me personally. I was in Mongolia working as a historian who was a history teacher, and I had to leave the country under less than amiable terms because the government there also came down with a heavy dose and an extreme case of paranoia. And I will tell you that I am aware of continued observation even while I'm here in this country. In my home country of the United States of America, I have been followed, I have been harassed, and I have been intimidated by the Mongolians because they can't get over it and leave it alone. And when I was in Mongolia, I do believe that had I not been a United States citizen, and had I not informed our embassy in advance that I was having specific meetings, I might have ended up a body in the Gobi Desert, or the Gobi, which means desert, or in some other part. I might have died. I might have ended up just like that PhD student. So Dr. Catino must understand that anthropologists, historians, and archaeologists are often looked upon with great amounts of suspicion as to what are you really doing here? Yeah, we know that you say you're doing this, but are you really doing that? And I face that question. I had a member of the General Intelligence Agency in Mongolia ask me point blank several times why I was so interested in history and if somebody could be as interested in history as I am. And I was floored. And I'm trying at this early stage to conceptualize how can you ask that question? Of course I'm into history this much. Of course, I love what I'm doing that much. What do you mean? I'm thinking about doing my PhD in history. Very different levels of expectations. I wouldn't say naivete at that point, but definitely not something I had encountered before, and to that degree. And so, Dr. Catino, if you are listening to this, you know, you have to understand there are a lot of risks and there are a lot of accidental red flags that are sent up by researchers in these areas. And unless we are able to have bodyguards and to have advanced directives on getting out of the country without losing important documents like our passports, then the risks are definitely on the wrong side of the risk reward uh, balance sheet. Uh, and it's just simply not worth it. It just really is not worth it. Now, some people are smarter and more capable than others. I went to Mongolia to teach. But if I had gone there for research, understanding what had happened to the man in Egypt, I likely would have flown in, done temporary research, tried to assess, gather as much information as I could, then leave the country as quickly as possible and then make some evaluations. I think that the principal reason why he died was that he just continued to stay. And as soon as he learned that people were asking for money and he was refusing, he should have left that night or the next morning, knowing that there was the possibility that this could happen. But again, it reflects this basic, uh, this basic lens, this irrevocable mental framework. If you're a cow, you're not going to think like a frog. If you're a researcher who's an anthropologist, I think there is almost an innate framework, as some people say in social circles that I go in. You look at it through a certain lens. You look at it, and it maybe if these were tinted rose, then everything is red. And some of us are just born with the red tinted glasses. And it takes a lot to take those off and to put on a new set of glasses with a new perspective. So again, I criticize Dr. Catino for criticizing those of us for apparently a failure to innovate and break away from the path. So I said that I would deal with this, and I'm going to deal with this now as I try to wrap up the video. Why am I taking military operations? Why am I doing an MA in military operations? Quite frankly, for one very big reason. Because while I have not encountered it professionally yet, I have had personal discussions where the accusation of being an armchair general has been thrown out. Many historians, especially military historians, get tarred and feathered with this very vulgar and what I consider a very vile accusation of being an armchair general, a know it all from the distance. Well, you only know it because you're studying it from the past. And that is something that I have really fought against. I have had a love for the military since I could remember. And it wasn't something that I had to just, stand up one morning and say, you know what, I'm going to have a big, big interest in military studies. Woohoo! Go team. No, it was just cultivated. And it just grabbed my attention when I would watch Patton for the 40th time on TBS Superstation when I was growing up in the 80s, when they would have Midway and all the other war movies. Then I would watch on the news. I was old enough to start understanding some of the first intifada in Israel. I watched the news with my dad. I mean, my dad would come home at about 5:15, and at 5:30 we would be in front of the TV watching World News Tonight with Peter Jennings, ABC News. He would generally fall asleep about 5:45, waiting for dinner, but I would watch the whole program and try to talk with him through it. Then in 1990, we were doing school when the invasion of Kuwait took place, and all of a sudden, in my home, not even my school, but in my home, posters of the Middle East, Kuwait went up. Whenever I was home, my and whenever my parents were home, which my mom was home all day, so she had the news on 24/7. As soon as she woke up, the news went on as soon as, and it didn't go off until they went to sleep, which was usually after nightline. And we did the same with them. And so that conflict came at a point in my life, in my cognitive life, in my social life, in my interest life, that it really grabbed me and took a hold of me. And as you can probably see, I have maps on my walls. I have lots of history books. The news is on over here, over to my side, and it goes on the moment that I wake up and stays on until I go to sleep. So there's nothing I don't see. I watched a lot of documentaries, war documentaries, espionage documentaries, a lot of other documentaries. I have kept this up even while going to college, presumptively for a different career. I kept a very strong interest in it while also reading lots of war histories and even some of the thicker histories like Battle Cry of Freedom by McPherson, even when, again, I'm not exactly in these studies. It was a personal choice. It was a personal decision after looking at a menu of potential career options later in life when I decided to transition careers. I looked at some different options. I made an actual list of possible choices and scratched each one off the list until I came down to history. And I realized that fundamentally this was an area that I could excel in, and this was an area that I would have great amounts of interest in. And so at 30 slash approaching 31 years old, I took my first master's degree, which was in punitively Middle East history, more narrowly focused towards an Iraqi primary civilizations of Sumer and Akkad. Going 15 years through being published in peer-reviewed studies as well as other study areas, I realized through publishing military history, I wanted to achieve a greater depth. I wanted to have a greater depth of understanding of military operations. I wanted to have a better idea of what I was talking about. That mental challenge and that curiosity was what compelled me and largely propelled me to finally, push it over and go for full studies in military operations. And hopefully, by virtue of doing so, I have now been able to work on exceeding and going past this idea of just being merely an armchair general and having some real life basis for understanding how a military operation comes together and what are the potential areas of success and potential areas of failure. But again, I am a greatly curious person, and I believe that the most successful, the best uh, person at history is the person who is most curious and willing and able to act on that curiosity and to take those opportunities to satisfy it. That is why, even though my principal area of studies is the Middle East, I still have an enormous number of books back here on tons of world history topics. Why? Because I'm curious. And because then I can look at those other instances and make comparisons and deeper analysis. But I am definitely not the norm. And many people would probably say I'm definitely not normal. uh, Trying to keep some sense of seriousness in this, that sense of curiosity keeps me going. And it is a sense of curiosity which might take me through a doctoral program, which I do hope to do one day. I will hopefully graduate when I am 48, just shy of 48 years old. I will probably take a couple of years off from school and then redunk myself back into those studies in a different institute where I can study with less, uh, what I would say, constraining and unnecessary classes. Even at my own institution, I see classes that are unnecessary, just bear no relevancy whatsoever to the doctoral pursuit. And that's why I chose to downgrade from the doctoral program to the military operations MA. I didn't want to waste 3 or 4 years of studies just throwing it all out when it was just a few courses more to get that degree. So I said, you know what, we'll make this very congruent and we'll do the MA and I'll do the doctoral degree somewhere else. Okay, so this video was intended to only be about 15-20 minutes. I am now coming up on 45 minutes. And this has been my hot take. I radically and fully reject Dr. Catino's characterization of anthropologists as having failed. They didn't fail to spot something because they were not looking for it. They didn't find a leopard because they were not looking for a leopard. They didn't find the emergence of Shining Path because they were not looking for the emergence of Shining Path. Even if these anthropologists had looked for, and if they had seen the emergence of Shining Path, they would have likely rejected talking about it because A, it fit with a part of their own particular views of social life and how humans should interact, and did not see it as warranting a critical response. Or B, they recognize the danger to their studies, both that their access to these people would be denied in the future, and it could potentially put them at risk in view of these people, and they might lose their life anonymously in the jungles of Peru to have attempted to expose this. So they felt probably a sense of danger. And number, or C, they also had no basic interest in security studies. If, as Dr. Catino asserts, they were able to view classified materials and other data from the United States government, I think that would have actually put them in greater danger. And if that, in fact, had been known to the government or to this group, they would have actually faced ostracization at minimum and death at maximum. And so their lack of curiosity in pointing these things out was not a failure. It was just a moment of being very different. And Dr. Catino should not demand that anthropologists, historians, or archaeologists have any interest outside of their own particular areas. Does Dr. Catino research anything in anthropology? Does he research anything in history or archaeology? If he does, that's wonderful. And that's very praiseworthy because it shows that he is a very curious individual. As I am a very curious individual and hope to be different and have a different perspective, but I am one among very few who have that same desire. But I don't criticize my colleagues in the history field. I don't criticize colleagues by extension in anthropology or archaeology for not having that interest. There are plenty of areas to criticize archaeologists or anthropologists, but I think that's something that's inside ball and might be talked about in a different venue or the same venue but different video. But my essential point is Dr. Catino needs to provide, and anybody else who cites this as a failure needs to provide a substantial reason why it was a failure. Thank you for watching this hot take, and I hope you have a uh, wonderful rest of your day or evening.